All right, so thanks again, everyone, for joining us. My name is Greta Zaro. I'm the organizing director with World Beyond War, and glad to be here with you all today. As I said, we are recording today's webinar, and we will post that on YouTube afterwards. We'll send out an email to all the registrants when the recording is available. We also have closed captioning on today. If you need to view the captions, you can click on the CC Live Transcript button to enable the captions. A reminder that captions are done by robots, so please excuse any errors with the transcription. And we will be using the chat box for our Q&A today. Executive Director David Swanson will be handling the Q&A part, so please direct your questions in the chat to David, and he will be able to compile those and ask them to our presenters. So with that, I will pass it over to Larry and Al from the Central Florida chapter of World Beyond War, who will introduce today's event. Go ahead.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar entitled Peacemaking in a Time of Endless War. It's our pleasure this evening for Al Mitty and I. Al and I are both members of the Central Florida World Beyond War chapter, as well as Veterans for Peace chapter 136. So anyway, I'll turn it over to Al for the first introduction, and I'll follow.
Okay, thank you, Larry. And thanks to everyone for joining in on this webinar as well. I'm going to introduce Yurii Sheliazhenko, who is on the board of World Beyond War, and we're going to hear from him. Yurii Sheliazhenko, PhD, is as I said, member of the board of directors of World Beyond War. He is based in Ukraine. Yurii is executive secretary of the Ukrainian Pacifist Movement, a board member of the European Bureau for Conscientious Objection, and a council member of the International Peace Bureau. He obtained a Master of Mediation and Conflict Management degree in 2021 and a Master of Laws degree in 2016 at KROK University. In addition to his participation in the peace movement, he is a journalist, blogger, human rights defender, and legal scholar, an author of academic publications, and a lecturer on legal theory and history. He has been a facilitator for World Beyond War's online courses. Yurii is a winner of the International Peace Bureau's 2022 Sean McBride Peace Prize.
And it's my pleasure to introduce to you John Reuwer. John is the treasurer and member of the board of directors of World Beyond War. He's a retired emergency room physician whose practice convinced him of a crying need for alternatives to violence for resolving tough conflicts. This led him to the informal study and teaching of nonviolence for the last 35 years, with peace team field experience in Haiti, Colombia, Central America, Palestine, Israel, and several US inner cities. He worked in South Sudan with the Nonviolent Peace Force, one of a few organizations practicing professional, unarmed civilian peacekeeping. He also serves on the committee to abolish nuclear weapons with Physicians for Social Responsibility, educating the public and politicians about the threat of nuclear weapons, which he sees as the ultimate expression of the insanity of modern warfare, so blatantly displayed in the current war in Ukraine. John has been a facilitator for World Beyond War's online courses, War Abolition 201 and Leaving World War II Behind. So without further ado, I think we're going to go to Yurii.
Dear friends, greetings from Kiev, capital of Ukraine. Luckily, I have electricity now to record this video. but after Russian attacks on electricity and heating stations, 40% of energy infrastructure in Ukraine is ruined, and there are planned blackouts throughout the country. Tens of thousands of people were killed and injured. Millions lost homes in result of war. Russian army intensifies attacks in Donbass and Ukrainian army counterattacks in Kherson region. Artillery duels endangered civilian objects, destruction of which could have catastrophic consequences, like the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and Novokakhovka hydroelectric dam of the Dnipro River. Recent Russian allegations of illegal nuclear program in Ukraine, rejected by our government and subject to international inspection, could mean that Russia is preparing for a new attempt to invade and occupy Ukraine, like United States invade Iraq. Presidents Putin and Zelensky ruled out territorial concessions, and on that ground they avoid peace talks. Zelensky even enacted decision of Security Council of Ukraine, which claims that peace talks with Putin are impossible. But of course, there is always room for negotiations, and it was shown that Russia returned to Black Sea grain deal and during prisoner exchanges. United States and NATO countries stand with Ukraine in belligerence, sending weapons of billions of dollars worth, and refuse to negotiate with Russia its security concerns about NATO expansion. Belligerence on all sides is not wise from the common security point of view, but it is profitable for military-industrial complexes and their media wings successfully manufacture consent for indefinite war at the cost of declining welfare. Facing these long-term strategies of the war of attrition adopted in Moscow and Washington, peace movements in every corner of the world must develop and implement their long-term strategies. I suggest we must refuse to kill, tell truth, expose lies, learn and teach peace, work for peace, and cherish hope for the world without wars. Refusal to kill is also a first point in the statement on the peace testimony and Ukraine published by Quakers. Another points are relief of suffering, building the institutions of peace, and supporting peace building and removing the causes of war. Recently, Ukrainian Pacifist Movement published a document called Peace Agenda for Ukraine and the World. It says that current policies of war until absolute victory is unacceptable and must be changed. What is needed is a ceasefire, peace talks, and serious work to correct the tragic mistakes made on both sides of the conflict. Sooner or later, parties will sit at the negotiating table. If not after their reasonable decision, then under the pressure of unbearable suffering and weakening. Better we embrace reason, common good, and love to each other. There are a lot of good plans how to end the war, including Minsk agreements, peace proposal of Ukraine given to Russian delegation during negotiations in Istanbul, proposals of mediation by United Nations and several heads of states. After all, the peace plan tweeted by Elon Musk, neutrality of Ukraine, self-determination of people on contested territories under United Nations supervision, and cessation of water blockade of Crimea. Global stagflation pushes entrepreneurs to participate in citizens' diplomacy, like poor people and middle class are joining peace movements because of the cost of living crisis. I hope peace movements could bring together people of different wealth and beliefs out of necessity to save the world from the scourge of war, to divest from the war machine, to invest into a peace economy and sustainable development. Peace movements, organized and spontaneous, exist both in the East and West, in Russia and Ukraine. A lot of people on both sides resist the war passively and actively, avoid military mobilization, sometimes daring to declare conscientious objection to military service despite repressions. International community and civil societies must demand of Ukraine and Russia to respect human rights of objectors, and to give asylum those of them who managed to escape belligerent countries. I am grateful to John Reuwer, who came to Kiev a month ago. We prayed for peace in Ukraine and in the world. We discussed nonviolent resistance to war, conscientious objection to military service, and John's idea of unarmed civilian protection of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. It is visionary and courageous. Even preparation to implement it could be beneficial for capacity building of peace movement. And in case of success, it could be a good addition to 235 cases of nonviolent civil resistance actions in Ukraine against Russian invasion from February to July this year, described by Professor Philippe Daza in the report Ukrainian Nonviolent Civil Resistance in the Face of War. With John, we visit gigantic Soviet time World War II museum in Kiev. Its exhibition includes a lot of horrible, rusty military vehicles, including a mobile nuclear missile launcher. We don't have museums of peace in Ukraine, but we have this museum of mass madness. So sad. Also, we visited a memorial to hundreds of children killed in the war between Russia and Ukraine. There is similar memorial in Donetsk, Alley of Angels, commemorating children killed by Ukrainian army. This senseless carnage must be stopped, and its escalation to nuclear war, to the war between NATO and Russia, is unacceptable. There are no alternatives to diplomacy. Presidents Putin, Zelensky, Biden, and other leaders across the Atlantic should hear every day loud voices of millions of people calling them to stop hostilities, stop insane betting on indefinite war, stop seeking excuses for warmongering. They must hear popular demands to sit at the negotiation table or resign and allow more responsible leaders to stop the war. Weapons will not end the war. Common sense will stop the war. Repentance, redemption, and forgiveness will lead to reconciliation. Jeffrey Sachs made a good point at the Athens Democracy Forum that the main struggles of our time is to deal with climate and inequality. In other words, to live together on common planet. This is a common task for humankind and not a so-called victory of democracies over autocracies. Peloponnesian War between Athenian democracy and Spartan autocracy ended golden age and led to decline of ancient Greek civilization. And both belligerents ignored calls of philosophers to abolish slavery, reform unjust economies based on violence, as today self-proclaimed democrats do when curtailing democratic discussion to pave the way for war. And also their rivals, self-proclaimed traditionalists, do the same thing when breaking traditions of peace, politeness, and friendly neighborhood. World is not black and white, and the rival ideologies of pseudo-democratic Atlanticism and pseudo-traditionalist Eurasianism, creating simplistic enemy images of the East and West, as well as enemy images of neo-Nazi Ukraine and neo-Nazi Russia, are very wrong. Wrong enemy images and wrong ideologies of Atlanticism and Eurasianism. There is a reason why people prefer these ideologies to voices of reason. War is simple and attractive to simple-minded people, while peace is complex and needs education, needs intellectual effort. War is a result of ignorance, and peace is based on sophisticated knowledge and skills how to organize civilized life without violence, or at least with minimum amount of it. That's why peace education and peace research must be among our priorities. People used to war because they were taught to think war is inevitable, necessary, just, and beneficial. All of these are myths. People were taught there is no alternative to war-driven economy, but there is alternative, and rebuttal of these myths and the nonviolent security system alternative to war you can learn at our website WorldBeyondWar.org. If people lack knowledge how peace by peaceful means is possible in Ukraine and everywhere, if our knowledge is incomplete, and it is key difference of knowledge, it is always incomplete, contrasting to beliefs and ideologies which explain everything mostly in the wrong way. We need more knowledge. We must gather and disseminate knowledge to do right things instead of bloodshed, to build evidence-based peace. I heard many times the question, how can we remain pacifists in time of war? But how could Ukrainian pacifists do anything else? Peace-loving civilians, war-resistant, should remain themselves in any circumstances and preserve peaceful life, to which belligerents sooner or later will return, because peace, not war, is a universal norm of human life. Refusal to kill is a moral imperative and internationally recognized human right. But most importantly, it is foundation of our nonviolent way of life, which gives hope for a better future of humankind. Let's build the world beyond war together.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Yurii. And now we'll turn it over to John. John, go ahead.
I'll share screen here. So these are tough times for those of us who value peace. We seem to be living in an age of endless war. Ukraine is just the latest iteration of that, with no end in sight other than nuclear Armageddon. And we have so many other problems to deal with: pandemics, environmental collapse, climate change, social injustice, and wealth inequality. And war impacts each of those other problems in a negative way, which is why we at World Beyond War concentrate on eliminating it, so that we can free up the world's brain power, moral power, and financial power to deal with problems that we don't have as much control over as we do over war. So let's talk about it. Given the situation of endless war, where can we go from here? It can be very discouraging to have been a peace activist for a very long time, and I certainly don't have any answers to the problem of Ukraine. The good thing about this war, of course, is that people are paying attention to it, unlike all the other wars in the world going on currently that have actually killed far many more people. So I do have some ideas, though, and perspectives that I think can lead us in the right direction. So it's important to realize that while Ukraine gets the publicity that all wars should get, it's certainly not the worst war in the world. There are 26 active conflicts that meet the definition of war in the world right now. And Ukraine isn't even among the worst. Just in the current year, look at the numbers over the current year or recent years. In Yemen, which many of us have been trying to get the US to stop supporting the Saudi war there, almost 400,000 people have been killed. The Ethiopians luckily just brokered another ceasefire, but look at the number of deaths there on the bottom circle. Almost 500,000 people. And of course, the deaths we left in Afghanistan after $6 or $7 trillion, 20 years, and turning the country back over to the people we were there to defeat. But of course, it's not numbers that matter, right? It's the humanity that matters. So you have the direct victims of war that are traumatized both physically and psychologically. We know that huge numbers of soldiers come back changed for the worse with their post-traumatic stress, having suffered moral injury from doing things that everything else in their life taught them not to do, that is suddenly the norm for their job. Leaves them very traumatized. Right now in Ukraine, there are 8 or 10 million people outside of Ukraine. Far more women and children have left because the men are not allowed to leave. Yuri's not allowed to leave. He's lost that civil right, as are most other men in Ukraine. This picture on the upper right, I took in the town of Chernihiv up near the Belarusian-Russian border, which had been attacked early in the war by Russia and later deserted. But while looking at these damaged buildings, this huge concrete facades just blown off with artillery shells, we ran into 3 women who described for us how their neighbors' body parts were lined up on the ground afterwards as they were trying to find out who was killed and who wasn't. They were actually in this building when it was hit. They were horrified, traumatized. But one of them just said to me, "Why would the Russians do this? They're our brothers." And beyond the direct trauma of war, of course, there's the homelessness. 100 million people, far more refugees now exist in the world than even at the height of World War II. All those people have been displaced by war. And of course, as David points out, risking nuclear war, which is the end of civilization as we know it, in actual numbers of explosive, you're talking about 10 World War IIs in a few hours. And resulting in climate change within a few weeks, far greater than we're worried about happening in the next 50 or 100 years. And we risk this every day. You have nuclear powers for the first time confronting each other and actually having active war games practicing for this. And of course, even if we luck out and don't get a nuclear war and this war eventually ends, the preparations for the next war are so profound that we can't deliver a decent standard of living to a lot of the world's people. When we know that a small portion of military expenditures could solve so many human problems. So if there's all these downsides to war, why is it that people tolerate war so much? Why do they think it's necessary? And usually when you talk to people, certainly in my experience, you hear, it's just part of human nature. We've always had war, it always will be. There's really no anthropological, archaeological evidence that that's true. It's been around for a long time, but probably only as long as history, which is a small time compared to the total time human beings have been on Earth. When I talk to my more religious friends, I hear much about the problem of evil and how it's human sin and just bad decisions that individuals make that lead to war, and you just have to deal with it. Or you can have discussions about all the complex local and geopolitical factors that make war necessary. For example, it's only because NATO expanded when we promised they wouldn't up to the Russian border. And it's only because the Russians are evil people who want to reestablish the Soviet Empire. And you can go on and on forever and about many facts and figures that back those things up. So you spend a lot of time saying why war, but I'm going to offer today the final common pathway of all these things because it gives us a point that maybe we can work on. And for some reason, I'm going to say it's because we have war because that's where the money is. That's really where so much of our government expenditures around the world go. You can see in this graph on the left, the increasing expenditures over years with a little dip as the Cold War ended. We all thought we'd get a peace dividend and did have a little bit for a while. And then people made decisions that war was for some reason necessary and began to increase expenditures for it again. And on the right, you see that the war industry is hugely profitable. 200 billion a year is what the arms sales are worth. And they go mostly to a handful of companies. So let's just think about how we could have handled the Cold War, right? Russia was no longer a major threat. The Soviet Union dissolved. And since then, what the US, I'll speak from a US perspective, spent $16.5 trillion preparing for the next war, starting in 1991. If you add up their entire diplomatic budget, what they call all international affairs, which includes the State Department, Peace Corps, USAID, we spent about $900 billion. So with this ratio, who would be surprised that now we have much more war than we have peace from a government point of view? Now, why do people support such expenditures? Well, most people in my experience still believe that a strong military somehow equals security, despite tremendous amounts of evidence to the contrary. But equally important, they don't know about alternatives. And there have been studies done that when you ask people, would you support a war? If you phrase it in such a way of, we tried everything else, now would you support it? Most people will say yes, to defend whatever value they think the war is defending. But if you tell them, should we go to war or use diplomacy? Almost everyone will say diplomacy. So presenting alternatives and knowing alternatives and having good alternatives is critical. And we don't get much education in that, as Yurii pointed out. So World Beyond War, we have a working document called the Alternative Global Security System. There you can see in the middle. And in it is a description of all the things that we think would have to fall into place or be done to prevent or eliminate war. And we could have a whole webinar on what each of those are, but a lot of them revolve around using the international system of law, both humanitarian law and the International Court of Justice, treaties and paying attention to them, sending massive humanitarian aid to people who need it. Imagine if Russia had sent billions of dollars worth of aid to the Donbass region and appealed for humanitarian support and a ruling from the Court of Justice about whatever they thought the Ukrainians might be doing to the Russian speakers there, the different results they would have had other than what's happening now. There's almost no limit to these things. I want you to pay attention to the lower right-hand side, the two figures. So something called civilian unarmed peacekeepers would have to be deployed in very large numbers, and we'll talk about that a little more. And then there's another concept called civilian-based defense. Of all the things that are in our alternative global security system, these are our biggest weaknesses, and I want to talk about that a bit. So the war in Ukraine was predicted by many, many observers, military people, diplomats from both Russia and the United States, right from 1991, after the Soviet Union fell, until now. And because it was predicted, it was preventable. NATO certainly did not need to expand the way it did. The US does not need to have nuclear weapons in Europe, or nuclear weapons at all for that matter. It did not have to snub Russia when attacking Serbia, Iraq, and Libya against Russia's veto in the Security Council. Remember, the UN was formed to prevent the scourge of war. And one of the things they said is nobody goes to war without everybody agreeing it was necessary. And if you listen to Michael McFaul's book, he talks about watching over the years Putin getting angrier and angrier and angrier at Russia being snubbed while the NATO countries violated the UN Charter. Russia, in response to that, certainly didn't need to invade Chechnya and Georgia. They could have done the same things to deal with whatever problems they perceived there. Treaties that limited nuclear weapons threats, like the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which our presidents, the US, unilaterally withdrew from, could still be in place, reducing the threat, as could many other treaties. All the nuclear nations in 2017 could have joined the treaty for the prevention of nuclear war, or the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And had they done that, Russia might not now have the power to threaten nuclear war if any of the NATO powers, which could easily crush him, try to do so. And of course, the courts internationally, while they don't have policing power, they do have enormous moral support around the world. And ultimately, world opinion and legitimacy, I think, counts more than hard power in determining who wins and who doesn't. But the fact is, we didn't do all those things before this war, and we got a war, and one country invaded another. So the attack was not prevented. And most people, certainly in the world I grew up in, and most people I talk to now, think at that point you have only two choices. You either surrender and let Russia dominate and oppress Ukraine, or you go to war. But actually, there is another field of action, and we under the general word nonviolent action. And just think of that as absolutely everything else you could do besides prepare to kill and hurt people. Imagine freeing up those trillions of dollars of war spending. Imagine freeing up those hundreds of thousands of people building weapons, having them come up with other ways to solve conflicts. Now, we know from data that's been around for 12 or 13 years now that in certain situations, like you're trying to overthrow a foreign occupying power, or you're trying to overthrow your own dictator, that if you use nonviolent methods, you're much more likely to succeed than if you use violence. We know that historically that's true. Now, some of these numbers have changed in the 13 years since then, but the edge that nonviolence has over violence is only increased, not decreased. Likewise, if you wage a nonviolent versus a violent campaign, if your campaign is successful, these are the odds that you'll have a democracy 5 years later. Look at that. Over 50% if you use nonviolent methods and about 5% for violent methods. That's if you win your war or win your violent campaign. If you fail, the odds are much lower in both cases, but the ratio remains the same. Nonviolence wins out in these cases. Now, this is a little different from what do you do when you're actually being invaded. But in the case of Ukraine, think about it. In 1990, 89, they were totally dominated by Russia, their biggest fear now. And within a year or two, they were totally free without destroying their country or killing lots and lots of people. Now, it's not because Ukraine did so much, but it's because countries like Czechoslovakia and Poland had mass movements that, and as did the Soviet people in Russia itself, just decided one day they were not going to cooperate with that system anymore. So that knowledge is there. We have experience with this, and it's part of the reason there's options for Ukraine other than this war. Now, who's doing this work? Well, this is one of the problems. There are some excellent organizations. The two largest in the world that I'm aware of are the Nonviolent Peace Force, which places hundreds of people around the world doing active nonviolence in violent conflicts. I visited their office in Odessa, where they're going right up to the front line in Mykolaiv. But unlike in South Sudan, where we could go talk to armed actors, we could talk to government forces directly, we could talk to the opposition forces and literally stop conflicts. The front lines in Ukraine are like 30 miles apart. They're just artillery shelling back and forth. So the same principles don't hold, but the force is still there to help people out of violent situations, help the weak who cannot leave, and provide whatever they support while taking the risks that soldiers are taking on the front lines, which I think is terrific. Cure Violence comes from a medical model. They are all over the world preventing community violence for the most part. But their founder, Gary Slutkin, is thinking hard about who can do the violence interruption on an interglobal level. I expect to have a phone call with him in the next week. So I met Philippe Daza in Brussels at a conference. He's been in Ukraine both before and after this war, studying who's doing what in terms of nonviolent action. And he works with a group called Novak in Spain, and has produced this 55-page documentation of everything in the first 4 months that the Ukrainians did. So if you want to get his paper, here's a link to it, or we can put it in the chat later, anybody that wants it. But anyway, through a series of interviews and studies of literature, he found specifically 235 nonviolent actions that were documented, and then categorize them according to Gene Sharp's conceptual framework of nonviolent action. What are they acts of, what kind of resistance is it? Is it protest and persuasion? Is it physical intervention? Is it symbolic? Many, many factors that people who study these things know, and he's got all that cataloged. So we all saw the pictures in the first few weeks of the war. I was very excited, knowing this history of Ukraine, knowing that in 2004, I used to show the movie called The Orange Revolution about how the Ukrainians overthrew a faulty election results, spending months in the streets, mostly peacefully changing the regime. And even given the questions about whether that was a US-sponsored coup or not, it was an amazingly peaceful transfer of power that was partially repeated in 2014, but for reasons that we could talk about a long time, that turned largely violent and set the stage for the initial Russian interference in the eastern Ukraine. But what we saw was people doing things that people do in dire circumstances. Here they're going to church, looking for hope where they could. I saw the picture of all the monuments. The Ukrainian monuments were all protected from destruction of the attacks, so that they wouldn't lose the symbols of their culture. And interestingly, the Ukrainian monuments were all protected like this, while all the Russian monuments, of which there are equal number in Ukraine because the cultures have been so close, were all unprotected and desecrated. In Lviv, which is a city, didn't get a direct attack, but people held concerts in the open air right in the middle of the war saying, hey, you're not going to get us down. You're not going to rob our freedom or our culture. And people started doing more active things, building blockades where they thought Russian invaders might come, just civilians doing this kind of work. And of course, a more sophisticated version of that are these things called hedgehogs, which are supposed to slow down tanks. This is a picture in March. By the time I was there in Odessa, these were all off to the side, all ready to be used again, but weren't interfering with anything of the very normal life I saw in Odessa. People immediately started helping each other with food distribution points and helping refugees get away and be safe. Of course, in the Mariupol, which is probably the biggest city that's been thoroughly ruined now, people still get together and they help people and do the best they can under the circumstances. These are pictures I took of the road into Chernihiv in the north, where this highway, which matched any good highway in the US in quality and smoothness and so forth, had been destroyed. And funny that one Ukrainian I was driving with said, oh, this was blown up by the Russians. And then the city council person we met with in the city said, no, that was blown up by the Ukrainians to keep the Russians from going further south. So in wartime, it's very hard to tell the truth. What is unequivocal is the destruction. Another form of resistance is even though the active war is still going on, the Ukrainians are rebuilding everything as fast as they can in defiance of somebody else's determination to conquer them. We saw the pictures of people doing the Tiananmen Square tank man imitations, actually literally delaying tanks for large periods of time. There are stories where the tanks turned around and didn't come back. This kind of resistance was widespread in those first few weeks. People changed the sign to confuse Russians about where they were going. The biggest single story of nonviolent action that I've heard so far is actually in Belarus, where Belarusian railway workers, including the head of the nation's railway system, praised whatever people he said he didn't know them. Of course, they were his employees to some extent, switched the train tracks so Russian troops couldn't be moved as efficiently into the country. And the success came that he got so much of this kind of resistance from his own people, just refusing to help Russians, even though he officially was a friend of Putin. I think it led to the decision that he would not use Belarusian soldiers in the Ukrainian war. And he stuck to that, and that's probably made a big difference. And that's largely due to the resistance of his own people. Of course, we saw pictures of this too. This was a famous video of a Russian soldier who had been captured, and instead of beating him or putting him in prison, they were giving him food and letting him call his mother on the cell phone. The Russian soldiers initially were pretty shocked that this was a war. They were told it was an exercise, or they were going into a country that would welcome them as heroes, kind of like we were told about Iraq with the US. And of course, this support was all over the world. This is part of that legitimacy that I say really gives nonviolence its power. People are really behind Ukraine. They don't like countries being invaded one after another. And one thing everybody agreed on, no one has ever seen this number of refugees, millions and millions of people, not in refugee camps, but taken into the homes and normal lives of people all over Europe. While there's some racist overtones to that, it's still a remarkable thing that this is one way. If people don't want to fight in the war, they can just leave and be accepted and supported by others. And then that leaves them time and energy and money and lives to go back and try other things to get their country back. And this certainly extends to Russia. We all saw Marina Ossianikova's protests right there on live TV. A TV commentator, well known over the country, says no war. Of course, she was arrested and so forth, but people all over were doing this. And what happened to all this nonviolence? Well, it really got buried, didn't it, in a barrage of weapons. The U.S. just started sending tens of billions of dollars of weapons, thousands and thousands of missiles, and millions of rounds of artillery shells and small arms fire. And so there wasn't any room or much money to support all those nonviolent things. So let's just look at the numbers a little bit. World military expenditures, and this is a couple years old, so it's now hit the $2 trillion a year mark, all right, for world military expenditures, everybody getting ready for the next war. While the total UN budget, the only international body whose mission it is to prevent the scourge of war, doesn't even show up on this graph. The UN peacekeeping budget, its active thing of trying to get people not to kill each other when they've already started to do that, is smaller yet. And if you look at the money devoted to the biggest nonviolent civil resistance or unarmed civilian protection groups in the world, Nonviolent Peace Force and Cure Violence, the budgets are even smaller. In fact, as we blow those up, you've got $12 billion just short of that for the United Nations, half of that for United Nations peacekeeping. And again, these nonviolent efforts don't shoot up. So that's why I see this as, whatever the reasons for this, is the final common pathway. And until we fix this, it's going to be hard to see how we get peace. So we don't have that, all right? We can say right now that civilian-based defense and unarmed civilian protection are not up to the capacities of war. Those are weapons we do not yet have. We're perfectly capable of developing them. We don't have them yet. So then what do you do? So let me make some suggestions on that. Why not just win? Because we don't have those other weapons developed enough. We do have lots of real weapons, and won't that give us victory? Problem with that, of course, and I respect the Ukrainians, almost everybody I talked to until I met up with Yurii and his group, people who've been working for peace for decades. And I asked them what they wanted the United States to do. Most of them said, rather reluctantly, but they said more weapons. We just can't see another way when you're under that kind of attack. So it was refreshing to finally get to Yurii and other pacifists and be reinforced by an Italian group and the Nonviolent Peace Force, who all said, no, more weapons are not the answer. We do have other things we can do. But the problem is war is unpredictable. And not only if Ukraine keeps fighting, like it almost certainly will, the Russians show no sign of giving up, every city in Ukraine could turn out looking like Mariupol, of which is shown in these pictures. And we have to remember that Putin is perfectly capable of making Washington, D.C. and most American cities look like Mariupol in a few hours with nuclear weapons. And we're taking that risk every day. Even Joe Biden finally admitted we are facing Armageddon here. Now, he's not doing anything that I can see to stop that other than not attacking Russia directly. But we're not reducing the risk. He's not escalating as fast as he could have. And meanwhile, even if, let's say, Ukraine did somehow win a victory and Russia tucked its tail between its legs and went home, that's just going to be a loss of face for them, and their military performance at this point looks pretty abysmal. And they'll make sure they never perform that poorly again, I can assure you, if something else isn't done. And NATO, which already outspends Russia 15-1 in its military, if I were worried about the NATO budget, I would say, gosh, these guys are terrible fighters. I would cut my defense budget immediately in half and start making sure everybody's warm this winter and meet people's needs. But instead, that 15-1 isn't good enough. They want to increase that. The European Union, which started as a peace project to prevent the 80 million people killed in 2 world wars in the 20th century, is now militarizing, just getting ready for more war. And this hyper-militarization really is not going to help us a bit in the future, because it ignores what's obvious to me is a much clearer and present danger, and that is nuclear weapons. Right now, North Korea, which had stopped testing its missiles and nuclear weapons when Trump agreed to stop playing war games on its border, is now responding to war games on its border with more missiles, and everybody says they'll have another nuclear test. We have no defense against this stuff. And yet we're ignoring it. China, which has kept its nuclear arsenal, most people agree, at about 250 weapons since they did their first launch in 1963, is now doubling or tripling their capacity. And I see no efforts to get them not to do that, even though we have no defense against it. It's just nutty to me. And almost every mainstream press in one form or another is talking about, oh, we could, even though we couldn't beat Afghanistan, now we're going to take on China and Russia and win. And therefore we need more military weapons. This level of insanity is impressive. All right, so if Ukraine doesn't go for victory and they've got these invaders tearing their country apart, what can you do? Well, as Yurii said, there's plenty of reasons to negotiate. Putin you can negotiate with him. He negotiated the shipments of grain through the port of Odessa again. They negotiated many exchanges of prisoners. They negotiated humanitarian corridors. So you can negotiate with anybody if you're willing to. But I have to agree with the Ukrainians who said this over and over again. If we give Russia any territory right now, they are just going to build themselves stronger and take more later. And I agree with them 100%. If we just do that, if we just negotiate this and stop, it'll be worse than it is now. They're totally right about that. So what we have to do is all those things we've talked about that could have prevented this war have to be done now. And if we don't do them, then we're going to have more war. The second nonviolent way to end this war that I see would be massive support for Russian opposition to the war. By a report from Moscow, 700,000 Russian men have left the country rather than fight. And the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, as well as Poland, are keeping them out. They're saying, you can't come through our territory. And so they're saying, oh, we'd rather you be in the Russian army with the ability to attack us than let us handle you here. And yes, I can see where they might be afraid that they're all Russian agents or cells ready to attack, but the amount of money we're spending on war, you could monitor every one of those Russians at all times and not have them as a soldier in the next war. And the third thing I'll talk about is a demonstration of unarmed protection, something that we don't have a tool yet and here's a step in the right direction that I'll talk about shortly. So let's talk about that Russian resistance briefly. So Marina Asyanikova, the TV star that got arrested in the first weeks of the war, is still free. So this thing that Russia would kill any opposition whatsoever isn't quite true. There are tens of thousands of people perhaps in prison. It's very hard to demonstrate and very risky to demonstrate there. But there are so many ways to express opposition without getting arrested that we know about now. And they're not getting much support. There are protests everywhere. This is a number from February 24th. Early on, there were 15,000. There's a lot more in prison now since then. But it goes far beyond street protests, which are the things that tend to get people arrested. Look at all the celebrities. Here's the tennis star Andrei Rublev, No More War, which got out to millions of people who like tennis. Supporting people and getting more and more of this could work wonders. The Russians have deserted in large numbers. I heard that the recent successes in the Northeast by the Ukrainian army taking back towns was largely due because Russian reinforcements refused to follow orders and reinforce the people that were retreating. That was certainly a major contribution to getting the U.S. out of Vietnam when soldiers just refused orders. That really terrifies the military. And we could be supporting that in various ways. One, not the least of which, is to make conscientious objection not only legal in Ukraine, but invite the Russians to do the same. So those hundreds of thousands, I'm sure, would rather be home in Russia, but they should be allowed to be conscientious objectors. If we did this in all countries, it would be like the old bumper sticker I remember, what if they gave a war and nobody came? I mean, you have billionaires, which have a lot of resources, that don't like this war for many, many reasons. Some of them fall out of windows, but that's a small number compared to the number killed in war. And they have a lot of power they could use to support that dissent. And here's just a picture of the airports being filled with some of those 700,000 men. So where does that leave us now in this room? The first thing I'd say is abolish nuclear weapons. Everybody ought to be a member of one or both of these listservs and take action whenever you feel led to. The International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons says the only way to make us safe is to abolish them. And that's absolutely true. Just think, if Russia did not have nuclear weapons, this war would not have happened. Nuclear weapons clearly don't help anybody win a war. They don't help anybody prevent a war, but they do allow people to bully, as Russia is demonstrating, and we've got to get rid of them. Back from the brink is the steps you would take in the meantime until you can actually abolish nuclear weapons. And just go to preventnuclearwar.org And you'll see 5 things: stopping, taking the weapons off of quick fire alert, taking away the ability of the president alone to launch them, taking them, reducing the number of weapons by failing to spend more money on them, and several other things that would reduce the risk of nuclear war immediately until we abolish them. A second thing is to decrease military spending. So we all probably know in this room that every time the budget is up, the Pentagon says we need this much to keep the country safe. And then the Congress says, no, you need more than that. And they give them more, and then everybody votes for it. There's almost no discussion about that. And we've just got to scream and yell until there is discussion about that. Lindsay Koshy-Garin of the National Priorities Project wrote in a New York Times in 2019, at the time she was thinking how to pay for Medicare by doing things that would not decrease U.S. security, all the things in this little graphic and from that article, none of which would decrease U.S. security and yet save us a third of the military budget. Now, in addition to paying for other things that people need, like healthcare, I think some of that money should go into nonviolent resistance to prevent the next war. And then I'll ask you to join World Beyond War, because we have gotten past the thing where we've got to decide, is this a good war, or is this a bad war? I mean, look at the anti-war movement right now. It's split between those who are NATO supporters and those who are Russian supporters for whatever reasons, and they choose which is a good war and which is a bad war. We think all war is bad, that we can do better. And so I hope everybody on this call has signed our Declaration of Peace. I think Greta's going to put in the chat box these, if you want to sit there and sign up just to be on our listserv, that you agree with these 2 sentences, that war is really dumb, and I'll work nonviolently to end it. We have, Greta, you can tell us later exactly how many, but I think it's 85,000 signatures so far. Let's get a couple of million on there. And then if you want to go a step further, I think one of the reasons war exists is because of the fact that soldiers, for whatever reason, are seen as willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. They're willing to give their lives for something they believe in. Now, my personal experience is that's not why people I know go into the military. They go in for the benefits, but they're perceived as going in to save their country. And of course, the powers that want war make a huge thing of honoring them in all ways. They get on airplanes first. They are thanked for their service continually, although it's hard for me to see the service. And there's a lot of other people who do services that don't get thanked. But they're willing to sacrifice themselves. And one thing Kai Jacobson said to me when we talked about this was, if you're in the middle of a war, you don't need anti-war activists. Being an anti-war activist in the middle of a war is kind of like being sick and having a health activist instead of a doctor or nurse to treat you. We need people that know how to actually make peace in tough situations. And we are now having an effort to recruit people to go into Ukraine to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear facility in Europe, and train and be prepared and offer to the International Atomic Energy Agency, whose people are already there monitoring things to keep it safe at their own risk, and support them to create the demilitarized zone around that plant that they have asked for. So we've got up about 30 volunteers now without putting a worldwide call, which we'll do soon. And we're beginning to focus on what kind of training we need. And we want to offer that to the United Nations and then to the belligerents in this to prove that people are willing to take risks to save other people, that you don't have to kill to do that. So thank you very much, and we'll be happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, John, for sharing your personal experience of your trip to Ukraine and your insights from what you've gathered there. We have many questions that have come in from the chat, so I'm going to turn it over to World Beyond War's Executive Director, David Swanson, who has been compiling the questions, and he will be directing those to you.
Wonderful job, John, and lots of questions that you may have partially or fully addressed after they were put into the chat, but you can speak to them again, and some of them I'm sure you've not addressed. when you said negotiating a compromise on territory would be a very bad thing, and people were right to oppose that, and what we need to do instead is to do all of those things we should have done before. Can you elaborate a little bit on what those things are and how a ceasefire agreement and a peace negotiation would incorporate them?
Yeah, what I meant to say was that those compromises have to be made. That's part of negotiating an end to things. It's rare that both sides of one side of the war gets everything at once afterwards. Most wars end with a negotiation, and that means some sort of compromise, something giving up for it to get something else. What I'm saying is, if the Ukrainians are right when they see that written, they get very upset because they're saying, well, how those people tell us to give up our land? And they have that argument that if we do it now, Putin will just come back and take more later. And my point is that, yes, he will, just like he started this war because we didn't do all the things to prevent him from starting that war. One is taking his very legitimate security concerns seriously. Russia was promised in the early 90s that NATO would not expand past Germany. And the Warsaw Pact, which used to be the evil empire against NATO, totally dissolved. And there was no reason NATO couldn't have dissolved at the same time. And if it didn't dissolve, it didn't have to grow because there was no real threat. But from the Russian point of view, there's a tremendous threat. So paying attention to that and paying attention to real security concerns on the part of Russia is one of the things that needs to happen. The other thing is, in the Budapest agreements in the 90s, Ukraine, when they gave up their nuclear weapons, which weren't their nuclear weapons, when they gave the Soviets back the actual missiles that the Russians had control of, they were promised by, I think, Great Britain, the United States, and Russia, there might have been one more country, in that what's called the Budapest agreements, that their security would be guaranteed. And it wasn't, obviously. Russia invaded that country, one of those guarantors. Now, did we know that Russia was capable of invading them? Absolutely. Why? Because Russia has a huge nuclear arsenal and Russia has a huge army. There have been no attempts to reduce the ability of any of those nations to invade. And as long as people have the capacity to do so, obviously, give enough provocation, they will do so. And so disarmament, treaties, like so many treaties, there's treaties on conventional arms, there's treaties on nuclear weapons, there's all sorts of treaties that reduce the ability of countries to invade, and they were all ignored. And so we need to actively, so if they were to negotiate an end to the Ukrainian crisis, it's critical that we get nuclear weapons out of the equation as fast as possible, and then work on treaties to demilitarize other things. You could create treaties, for example, that nobody can mass soldiers on their borders like Russia did. Remember, Russia did it, and the US said they're going to invade, and Zelensky said, no, they would never invade, and many of us thought they wouldn't. They did, but if they didn't have troops on the borders, they couldn't invade. So a lot of interventions could have happened at that point. Does that help?
What a number of questions. What efforts for peace, peace activists in Ukraine, what efforts for peace are underway there and in Russia? And by how many people? And are they in touch with each other? And how can we help from afar?
Efforts at making peace, I saw very little of in Ukraine. Like I said, most of the peace organizations I saw said, we don't see any way out of this other than a military victory. In terms of people resisting now, you have to think that something like near a quarter of Ukrainian population left. And that means that they were not willing to participate in a war. So in a sense, all those people were for peace. I did not get into the behind Russian lines to see what people in the East thought. The attempts at peace have been done at the government level so far. Remember, Turkey, the Pope, all kinds of nations have called. Macron has tried to talk to the Soviets and get people to the negotiating table. I did not see much support on the ground from ordinary Ukrainians that they had support for that. On the other hand, once we got them in a room and started showing them a lot of what I showed you today of how much resistance there was. A lot of the people who ostensibly are peace people seemed relieved and were really anxious to read those reports and hear that. And in terms of supporting them, it's a matter of publicizing what they're doing, and reports have come out about that now, but those all need to be funded. The one that's so obvious to me, again, is taking care of these 700,000 Russians who have left. If we could show that the rest of the world would welcome those and make sure that people in other countries whose soldiers want to leave rather than fight a war are supported equally, so that it's not just an anti-Russian thing, I think we could make some real progress on that. Likewise, you could, I showed you Philippe Daz's report. He's doing it on the salary of an academic. If you paid 100 people to do that, a salary of a couple tens of thousands of dollars each, they'd be happy to do it. And all of a sudden this stuff would get out and could be publicized. You could make movies, you could make videos. There's just no money in it for that right now.
Can peace activists get into Ukraine? Are they welcome to enter Ukraine? Are there groups to host them in Ukraine?
I would have to know what you mean by peace activists. When I was there was a delegation of 30 or so Italians representing at least 30 different organizations who were there to talk about peace. I saw when some tried to even use the word peace with a government official that they were redressed and said, don't talk to us about peace. What you mean is we have to submit to the Russians, and that's not going to happen. I don't want you to use that word anymore. But that was rare. Most people were they were well received in the groups I saw them with, and I didn't see any protest against them or any censuring of that. Yurii can tell you at least one of his friends in the Ukrainian Pacifist Movement is in jail for spreading ideas. Yurii has managed not to do that, I guess, because he hasn't been trying to recruit other people into the pacifist movement. But yes, I could go. The Nonviolent Peace Force is there. There are lots of ways to go in, sure.
700,000 military age males from Russia have fled. How many from Ukraine since February?
Well, again, men aren't allowed to leave the country. The two examples personally that I knew are one of the Quaker pacifists that's been in Kiev that I was hoping to meet had just left a few days before I got there, because after 6 months of trying, he was finally granted, for medical reasons, the freedom to join his son in Australia. So again, there have been millions of people that left, more women and children than men, but I'm sure millions of men have left too. And I see that as opposition to the war.
These 700 Russians, why didn't they oppose the war before getting drafted and then jumping up and leaving?
My answer to that is because war is a fabrication of the people in power that use both the fears and the aspirations of younger men to carry out their plans, and war is not an aspiration of the overwhelming majority of young men.
If aggressors, that's the word used by the questioner, are willing to kill civilians, what difference would it possibly make to have a peacekeeping force there? They're willing to kill them too, right?
I'm not sure what that person means by peacekeeping force. United Nations armed troops can only generally go in when there's been a ceasefire and agreement to allow them by both sides. And then once both sides agree to allow peacekeepers in, I see much more benefit to unarmed than to armed peacekeepers. You have to look at the situation. I have enough experience in small situations involving dozens of people that when you treat people who can be very aggressive and harm people with some of the elements of the techniques of nonviolent resistance, that they respond more positively. Because, well, think of it in the case of the Russian soldiers in the pictures that we saw in those first couple of weeks of the war, right? there were lots of reports of soldiers being told they were on a training mission, or they were going into Ukraine because there were some neo-Nazis in Ukraine abusing Russian-speaking people, and they were going to relieve them. So they went in expecting to help people and to find happiness. And if they had found that kindness that the one slide showed, if they'd been treated like human beings for coming in, how angry and mean can they do? How much killing would they do? Now compare that to the same soldier who's entering a town, and the heads of all his buddies have just been blown off by the Ukrainian defenders trying to defend their country. And he's told, look at those evil people. All they want to do is kill Russians. I'd say he has the ability to be a lot more aggressive when he confronts those same civilians. So what we don't know is, we know that war, and this war, like all wars, will kill it's already killed many tens of thousands. It easily could kill hundreds of thousands. And if something goes nuclear, tens of millions. We're willing to take that risk on war, but we haven't really taken that risk yet on a major scale with unarmed peacekeepers, civilian resistance. We know that once you're occupied, if you want to get rid of your occupier, you're much better off using nonviolence. And we know that Ukraine several times has relieved itself of dictators without a war.
How can we get governments to a negotiating table, or alternatively, negotiate without them?
It's hard to imagine negotiating without them, without massive uprising of people that are doing their bidding in carrying out the war. The best example there is in Russia, because there's so many resisting that, and they're resisting what looks to most people like the more unjust side of the aggressors. You just can't get around the fact that Russia's invaded a sovereign country. And supporting them in every way we can, including by giving the same privileges to our own soldiers that we demand Russia give them: full conscientious objection, help to not participate in a war if you choose not to, support you while not participating in a war, I think are ways that we could do that. Can you do that without governments? Well, governments fall when people refuse to cooperate with them. So to the level with which we don't cooperate with war is the level to which we will insist on negotiations. Again, the Vietnam War ended largely because soldiers in Vietnam, American soldiers who saw the nonsense going on there, refused to follow orders. It's really hard to carry out a war when your soldiers are unreliable.
When you say, why is there war? Why is there war? It's not this, it's not that. It's because that's where the money is. Can someone not reply, okay, but why is that where all the money goes?
Well, that's the difficult question. And I hope I didn't say wrongly that it's not all those other things. It's absolutely all those other things. It is all those local and geopolitical factors that happened. It is people's belief that violence is the final arbiter of conflict. It is people believing that war is inevitable. It's those belief systems that make war possible. I'm just saying the final common pathway of all those beliefs is we're willing to throw so much money at it. So getting rid of the money, you can just stop doing it. You can not pay taxes. There are people in this call who have spent a lot of their life not paying war taxes. That goes a long way. But like the Russian soldiers having to leave because they don't want to fight in the war, if enough of them did that, they wouldn't have to leave their country. So it's really a matter of just talking to enough neighbors and friends to get them to agree. I talked to a fellow in Moscow, an American that's been living there for the last 20 years, about what he saw just in his neighborhood and his circles in Moscow, about how much support there is for the war. And he said, well, a third, hate it, think it's stupid. They can't always say that in public. A third don't give a hoot. They don't think about it one way or the other. And a third are just absolutely behind anything. This is my country, right or wrong. And I'm thinking, where did I hear that before? So the education that we have that war and God and country are all glorious is common to many, many countries, and it has to be overcome or changed if you want to end war. Not in everybody, but in enough people to win over that middle third. I don't think a third of the people who heavily support war could execute it.
Let me ask you a set of Russia is the evil force here, and Ukraine is right in all things questions, and then the reverse. So on the first batch, we've got questions like, is Ukraine a real country? Does Ukraine have the right to defend itself? How can you ask a young Ukrainian not to defend his friends and relatives? Would Russians have deserted if Ukraine didn't have weapons?
Those are good questions. Those are very good questions. And I can't begin to speak for Ukrainians. I'll let Yurii speak for Ukrainians. I don't blame them a bit without other tools, without being trained in other things. I don't blame them for defending what they believe in their families and homes, one iota, not a slightest hint of condemnation of that. What I do care about is what my tax dollars and support go for. This war wouldn't have happened without U.S. interference in Ukraine, I don't think. It certainly can't be executed. And the reason it's not getting to the negotiating table is because we keep giving Ukraine hope that it can win this war. So rather than make any compromises, which I don't think are terribly unreasonable, and which Zelensky agreed to back in April or so, would be done if it weren't interference from my country. And that's what I'm concerned with. No, I will never take away anybody's or disparage anybody's decision to use whatever tools they think are appropriate. My concern with that, and the reason I wouldn't participate, and the reason Yurii, sitting in the middle of the bombing, disagrees, is he just sees his country slowly being decimated. And I don't see any way other than Ukraine end up looking like Iraq or Afghanistan before this is over. And we're all risking our countries, all of Europe, and maybe even the US looking like Mariupol before this is over. That's too big a risk for me. So I'm not going to blame them, but I am going to say, hey, I don't want to support that. I will try to support you in other things. If I had the power to take $1 billion worth of the next weapons and give it to all the nonviolent activists in Ukraine and Russia, I would do it in a heartbeat.
Let's try the flip side. What choice did Russia have? Can we talk without being Russophobes? I apologize, John. I don't know what you were saying at the moment that question was typed. What could Russia have done in the Donbass during recent years non-violently to prevent war?
Well, I hope that was asked before I mentioned it. I said Russia could have not invaded. It could have appealed to the International Court of Justice for settlement of the region. They could have asked for UN peacekeepers or unarmed peacekeepers to go in and protect Russian populations from whatever abuse they said we're getting from Nazi organizations or whatever. They could have appealed to human rights workers everywhere. There's lots and lots of things they could do at a tiny fraction of the cost of this war that they're executing.
We have a question just came in from Dresden, Germany. Says they're planning a peace event with Russian and Ukrainian and German people. And do we have any suggestions? And I would say get in touch with us and get in touch with John. But we have a number of questions, John, about how do I get involved? How do I volunteer in protecting the nuclear power plant?
Right now, the best way is just to email me, Greta, if you'll put my email in the chat box. We're building a steering committee. We've got some really smart people working on this now. We're getting worldwide attention, and we're about to use, I hope, if David and Greta agree, the global mailing list for World Beyond War to call for volunteers. We wanted to make sure that we had something that was doable, and we're getting very close to that. So I would hope within a week or two, we'd be putting out a call. But anybody that's interested and wants to learn more, I'll send you information immediately. I think that's the key that's missing in our alternative security system and in the peace movement in general. People admire soldiers because they're willing to risk themselves for it. We don't admire the politicians that send them to war, although we keep voting for them for reasons that aren't clear to me.
In the US media, we're told that pretty much all the Ukrainians support the war. Why do we not hear about Ukrainians opposing war?
Well, one thing that Yurii taught me, and we went around and kind of confirmed this, we did see graffiti saying no war around Kiev, but most of the propaganda. Most of the posters were all showing different kinds of soldiers, attractive women, and people giving medical help of soldiers doing great things to save their country, and a lot of thank yous for those. Kind of like they see in the US to some extent, a little bit more. But there's nobody calling for the other voices because people still perceive any inability to fight a war as weakening the war effort. And that's such a mistake to make, because just look at the wars since World War II. Look at the US in particular. We've been in countless wars. We have nuclear weapons. We have a military that spends as much on expensive equipment and soldiers as the rest of the world combined almost. And we haven't won a war since World War II. Because we're no longer trying to be the force for democracy and freedom, even though that's what the propaganda says, but we're just invading countries and making the world safe for corporations to extract wealth. That's the main reason. Just listen to Smedley Butler, 35 years in the Marine Corps, and that was the conclusion he came to, and war is a racket. Everybody should listen to his main speech. You can catch it on YouTube. To win a war, you have to be on the right side. You have to really be stopping an evil. And the Ukrainians are have some claim to that right now. Their country's being invaded, and it's a good thing. And I see no chance of the Russians winning this war. I do see some chance of the Ukrainians winning it, but probably not without looking like the Afghans who won the war, or nobody won Iraq. The Vietnamese won a war, but they paid a horrifically horrible price in the destruction of their country and the trauma from that. But the U.S. hasn't won a war in so long, and we have alternatives now. We can do those treaties. We can use the international courts. We can use public opinion to stop things.
You can no more win a war than a hurricane, some have said. What is the significance of the grain agreement and the re-agreement on the grain agreement, and what, if anything, does that portend for peace agreement?
Well, it's a funny thing when people talk about Putin, and I've seen really good-hearted people who haven't given as much thought as I would like them to, will say things like, oh, Putin is so evil, he just wants to reintroduce the Soviet Empire, and how can you possibly deal with a guy who would kill civilians? You can't negotiate with him. It's kind of like what I often hear, you can't get rid of nuclear weapons. And most people aren't aware that we've gotten rid of 80% of nuclear weapons because of mass civilian resistance to nuclear weapons in the 1980s and 1990s. And so the fact that we have negotiated with Putin to exchange prisoners multiple times, as Yurii said, we've negotiated with Putin for humanitarian corridors for people to pass through. There are holes in the front lines where Russians allow people to go back and forth between occupied and unoccupied areas with a lot of hassle, the Ukrainians tell me, but you can do it to go visit your relatives and so forth. It's I don't understand war very well that way. And they negotiated these grain shipments. And prisoner exchanges, grain shipments, and humanitarian corridors. They've all been negotiated with this monster. The other thing that's funny, says you can't negotiate with them. And I said, well, what about his using nuclear weapons? And they say, well, he would never do that. He's not that crazy. So he's crazy enough that you can't talk to him, but he's not crazy enough to do nuclear weapons. I'm much more worried about him using nuclear weapons than anything else.
I agree. Is Ukraine corrupt and controlled by oligarchs? And we could maybe ask the same about Russia. And I would add, is it controlled by right-wing fanatics who prevented peacemaking 3 years ago when a president was elected on that platform?
Yeah, you'd have to go to sources other than me for that first question about how corrupt is it. One of the ironies of this war is it's largely being fought over whether Ukraine has the right to join NATO. And multiple countries for the last 20 years have said Ukraine can never join NATO because they're too corrupt. And you can go look at their evidence of why the NATO would say they're too corrupt to be part of NATO. I'd refer you to those sources. As far as Russia being controlled by oligarchs, I think all major powers now, including the US, are controlled by oligarchs. Just the propaganda is very, very different. Is
Costa Rica a useful model here, and how do they do education in Costa Rica to maintain a military-free country?
I've only been to Costa Rica once, so I can't answer that question with any authority. From what I know is they abolished their military, and the result of that is they didn't participate in any of the horrible civil wars and wars of outside interference that the other Latin American countries did in the 1980s and 90s. And so we're much more peaceful, and all that money went into making their population safer and happier and so forth. Russia's excuse for this is, I mean, part of the reason for their invasion, they said, was to demilitarize Ukraine so it wouldn't be a threat to them. So if Ukraine had no military, could the Russians still push them around? Maybe. Would they destroy their whole country? Probably not. Ukrainians once were totally dominated by Russia, and they managed freedom without destroying the country. Again, all this is a little different when you're under attack, and I'm not blaming Ukrainians at all for doing the best they have with what they have. But one of the reasons they're executing this war and refusing to compromise is because we have sent enough aid to help them do that to almost match Russia's entire military budget.
We, meaning the U.S. government.
Yeah.
What do treaties matter if they are routinely violated?
None. If you violate them, they're worthless. So the question is, what keeps people from violating them? And generally what does that is norms. Chemical weapons, for example, have been banned by agreement of most major powers since the 1990s, and rarely violated. And when they are, there's immediately mechanisms. Everybody agrees it's horrific for reasons, again, David, that aren't super clear to you and me, why people hate the idea of being gassed to death, but seem to have less opposition to being blown apart. But they're generally not used. Another good example is the Treaty on Cluster Munitions, right? So the U.S., of course, didn't sign that. I don't think Russia signed it. Ukraine did. No, I shouldn't take. I'm getting that mixed up with the landmine treaty. But a great example of the power of treaties is cluster munitions. When it was banned, even the U.S. didn't sign it. There was only one plant in Connecticut that was manufacturing cluster munitions, and they stopped manufacturing them because of decreased demand around the world for cluster munitions because of the treaty.
But when Russia started using them in this war, voices in the U.S. started screaming, prosecute the crimes, until somebody pointed out that the U.S. uses them all the time. And then it kind of shut up.
Yeah.
I've been told we're running out of time. I'd love to try to get in maybe 3 more questions. 4 with this one. How do we share everything John is saying? Well, we get the video afterwards and share it. And it'll be at WorldBeyondWar.org/webinars. Here's one, John. Does Putin want to create an empire like the U.S. empire? And I would add, there's a lot of seeking the truth in the inner soul of Putin and what is his one true motivation. Is he really objecting to NATO expansion, or is he really seeking a Slavic empire and believes Ukraine is not a country and so forth? I'm not sure we have to choose one of those, but what do you say?
No, I have no idea what's in Putin's mind, and it's not terribly relevant to me. The enemy, in my mind, is not Putin. The enemy is war. It's the fact that we gave Putin the power he has by refusing to abide by these treaties, to unilaterally pulling out of treaties that reduce nuclear weapons, by refusing to participate, even let people talk at the United Nations about abolishing nuclear weapons. That was a gift to Putin to have nuclear weapons that has allowed him to do this. His motivations aren't as important as what we give him the power to do. And because of our desire to hold on to great power, we make sure that he can do the same. And once ordinary people in all countries follow Yuri's lead and become conscientious objectors, then none of these silly politicians, I don't care what their motives are, can make us do horrific things that we know we shouldn't be doing to each other.
Why is it easier to flee Russia than it is to flee Ukraine? And if that's so, what does that say about Ukraine's democracy?
That is a great question. Again, if you look at the European Union and the NATO, all the complaints they had about why Ukraine shouldn't be part of either of those organizations, which has changed with this war for other reasons. One of the things they said, it's not a terribly well-functioning democracy either. And it's certainly not in wartime. There's a lot of people angry with Zelensky for lots of reasons that I heard, not the least of which he promised everybody this invasion wasn't going to happen. And the fact that he changed his mind about peace and so forth. He's probably less popular inside Ukraine than he is outside. I think what are those papers that show where everybody's hiding money?
Panama.
What is it?
Panama.
Yeah, they're from Panama, but there's a name, Pandora Papers. Well, anyway, they're the people that watch who's hiding money, and Zelensky's right up there with a lot of other oligarchs hiding hundreds of millions, apparently, and they know that.
How do you propose to abolish nuclear weapons in Russia? How do you propose to abolish nuclear weapons? That's impossible. That's utopia. Are you nuts?
Well, that's the question I heard. How you'll never do it. And my first question back to them is, do you know that we got rid of 80% of our nuclear weapons? And if we can get rid of 80%, why couldn't we get rid of the rest? And we've already done it. To say that something can't happen that's been done is kind of an odd question to me.
There are dozens of wonderful questions that keep coming in. I think we have to respect everybody's time, and John's email is already in the chat. You can contact any of us through the World Beyond War website, and I don't know if Al or Greta or Larry, did anyone want to?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, David, for facilitating all of that and compiling those questions. Thank you so much, John, for taking your time this evening to share with us, what you saw in Ukraine and your insights from that experience. And of course, thank you so much to Yurii for the special message that you recorded for us tonight, which I found to be powerful and inspiring. And just Yurii is an amazing inspiration to all of us at World Beyond War with his persistent pacifism throughout this whole war. So thank you to everyone. And I do want to turn it over to Larry and Al for any final words.
Well, thank you, Greta. And we certainly want to thank John and Yurii for their excellent presentation. Al and I are both members of World Beyond War and also Veterans for Peace. And I see here in the chat that Veterans for Peace sailboat, Golden Rule, is sailing down the Mississippi River for a nuclear weapons-free world. And so that's certainly our goal from both organizations. And I'd like to say that a Vietnamese colonel named Nguyen Doi once said, "In every war, it matters not who won or lost, the people always lose." And that certainly is the case as we've seen in every war. And it's most unfortunate. And I think if we start taking the money out of war machines, creation of war machines, then maybe we will have peace. But our politicians, our elected officials have to be the ones to do that. So Al, any further comments?
No, thank you, Larry. Thank you, David. Thank you, Greta. Thank you, John. One comment, John, what you're doing with the effort to protect the Zaporizhia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, nuclear power plant is incredible and courageous. And as you know, I've volunteered to be a part of that. I would encourage others to consider that. We need peacekeeping forces all across the world.
Thank you, Al. Can I make one last comment about Yurii? He taught at universities in Ukraine. He's no longer allowed to do that because of his pacifist stance. It doesn't fit the mainstream media. So he's really in kind of bad financial straits right now. So if you wanted to support nonviolence in Ukraine, that's kind of one direct way to do it. You've seen how powerful his message is, and he's sitting there under fire giving that message. So you can get in touch with World Beyond War about that if you wish.
Absolutely. And we will send out a follow-up email to everyone with the recording and some links and resources as well. So be on the lookout for that. Thanks again, everyone, and have a good rest of your day, evening, wherever you are in the world. Bye-bye.